that obviously China now comes at par economically with the US, and financial markets are a bit in a split, because on the one hand they want to make good money out of China, and there are still plenty of possibilities to do it, but they can't follow their own rules anymore, because China has become so powerful in part by pushing back international rules on finance, on trade, on how to integrate in the global economy. And honesty would also force us to admit, those who are skeptical about how China did this, that China has become the success it is for its own population, economically speaking, because it pushed back on those international regulations, because otherwise they would have been simply bought up, like what happened in the Soviet Union after it collapsed.
刚才这段对话点破了一个长期被包装成国际规则的现实：当中国还弱小时，开放被说成唯一正确答案；而当中国凭借自己的道路成长起来，有能力守住产业、资本和发展主动权时，某些人突然发现，原来他们所谓的规则并不允许别人真正变强。大家好，这里是嘎人死绝频道。这期节目将从货币说起，拆解美元为何能长期主导全球金融体系，也追问这种主导地位背后究竟依靠的是市场信任、制度惯性，还是看得见与看不见的力量支撑？更关键的是，中国为什么没有照搬苏联式休克疗法？人民币国际化究竟是不是为了取代美元？去美元化的世界又会不会走向多种货币并存的新格局？从布雷顿森林体系到金融危机，从人民银行的货币互换到 CFS 支付系统，从中国守住发展成果到全球南方寻求更多结算选择。这场讨论远不只是汇率和钞票的故事，货币背后始终是产业、主权、安全与发展道路的较量。接下来就让我们走进正片，看看全球金融秩序正在发生怎样的变化。
To China, this answer and the question you asked, because I think that's one element that we have to take into the equation here. Obviously, financial markets and the position of the dollar, I mean, they have been very constructive in assisting China in integrating in the global economy through massive investment, and there were, private interests involved, and there was good money made. And now the situation has changed. Of course, many people have seen it coming a long time ago, but we were not discussing it. That obviously China now comes at par economically with the US, and financial markets are a bit in a split, because on the one hand they want to make good money out of China, and there are still plenty of possibilities to do it, but they can't follow their own rules anymore, because China has become so powerful in part by pushing back international rules on finance, on trade, on how to integrate in the global economy. And honesty would also force us to admit, those who are skeptical about how China did this, that China has become the success it is for its own population, economically speaking, because it pushed back on those international regulations, because otherwise they would have been simply bought up, like what happened in the Soviet Union after it collapsed. There's a very interesting book by Isabella Weber, and she's a German economist. I think she teaches in Columbia, and she wrote a book titled something like How China Escaped Shock Therapy. And it's the only book where I think there is a solid account of what happened inside China, on how actually, the party socialists and the adapters that after Deng Xiaoping were opening up to, okay, we have to catch mice. It doesn't matter what color the cat is. That's what Deng Xiaoping said in 79, 80. And China has just itself sort of crossed that river in from the socialist system to the capitalist system, touching the stones. And there was a very elaborate discussion on the inside. And us, from looking from the outside, we're just seeing, okay, well, they will come by. They will turn into capitalists like we do. They will turn into Democrats like we are. And this all it didn't happen. And now there's a reset, and that reverberates in the monetary system. Because the position of the dollar obviously is not as strong as it was, the reserve position. But then again, it's not necessarily going to end up in a situation where we have to choose between a dollar or a renminbi hegemon, because, in my opinion, the alternative to dollar hegemony is just a division and a fragmentation of that hegemony, and there will be necessarily place for all other currencies to fill up the gap of trust. But that also asks for a different political system and a different political arrangements. So that very much is, now we're getting to the core of what hegemony all is about. And it's not just about the technical part of financial markets, it's very much a political question.
So we can all agree that, of course, the dollar is still deeply embedded in the global financial system, but as you suggest, its dominance, it's in a way evolving in uneven, selective ways, and there's been an addition of events and shifts that have accelerated this transition. So again, as the system is maybe not collapsing, but potentially, let's say, evolving under pressure, this naturally, as you mentioned before, raises the question of alternatives. And the thing that stands out the most to me is the fundamental mismatch between the massive role that China plays in the global trade order and the comparative, let's put it that way, minimal influence it has in the international financial order. I have the chance to delve into your report that describes the RMB internationalization as a long-term project that has so far only seen modest progress despite significant policy efforts. So my question is, how should we understand this apparent gap between China's economic weight and the still relatively limited international role of the renminbi?
If I'm not mistaken, I think we talked about turning points, right, in terms of trust.
That's right.
I think for the Chinese, maybe another interesting turning point to bring to the table and then continue your questions, also to look at what happened with the Russian Federation after the fall or after the end of the Cold War, right? That got imposed our system. And I think you can read a post-mortem, and it didn't work out as we had wanted, right? For the Chinese, seeing also the financial aspects thereof, that was a dire warning. Now, the financial crisis was another one. And given the interlinkage, right, of our monetary systems, if I just only isolate monetary system, right, but the ripple that the 2008 crisis caused worldwide was massive. Now, if I'm the head of a country, I would like to minimize my exposure to disturbances to my own domestic peace caused by factors outside of my own country, right? I think that has been sort of the slow starting point of China considering that putting all its eggs in one basket, the US dollar, is maybe not the most stable, or better word, resilient way of running my international side of my monetary policy. So in that sense, that's been 2009-ish. So we talk about roughly 15 years. That's why it is a slow process, right? And then you can make it even slower if you have to consider that China needed to build up its capacity to get to a point where it could choose an alternative other than follow the dominant system, right? So it's even longer in that sense. And what China has been doing ever since, under that idea of let's minimize the ability to be shocked externally, is to slowly make inroads in internationalizing its renminbi.
I think what is very important to highlight here, and an observation that was made by a colleague of yours, Mr. Bert Hoffman, in a CKN interview, is that, of course, this financial crisis in a way bring scarcity of liquidity, which in turn pose a great burden on developing countries. And I feel like countries such as China, who have the potential to revert the situation by providing let's say, an alternative pillar is indirectly or directly appealing to those countries who don't want to be fully dependent on the dollar, especially regarding political transitions that shift very, let's say, dramatically the hegemony or dominance of the dollar in the current financial international system. So, would you argue that this reflects structural changes and features in the international monetary system in itself as a whole, or does it? What is China's main objective? Is it to displace the dollar dominance, or is it to establish a different pillar? How exactly is it aiming at achieving this objective? What kind of instruments do they promote to internationalize the renminbi? And how does this fit into China's broader monetary strategy?
I think the core of your question is what does China seek to achieve, and using monetary policy. Well, first of all, it is of course building out its industrial strength through the BRI system, and that's also where money is created and credit is created.
Yeah.
And this strengthens China as the pivot of an economic set of relations that is growing very fast. China uses it cannot apply the same strategy that the United States has or that Europe is doing, because it's not opening up its currency. That's the reason why the yuan is not a reserve currency, and it will never compete with the dollar seriously in terms of a reserve currency. So that, I mean, a currency that everybody uses, even if you trade between the Netherlands or New Zealand, we can do that in yuan, in renminbi, but nobody's doing it because it's not convertible. So you can't go to China and say, hey, I want to have dollars, and they will not do it very fast.
这期讨论表面上谈的是美元、人民币和欧元，实际上追问的是一个更基础也更容易被忽略的问题：货币究竟是什么？在经济学意义上，货币是支付手段，是计价单位，也是保存价值的工具。但如果只停留在这3个定义，我们就很难真正理解国际货币体系，更无法解释为什么一张纸、一串账户数字能够支撑起跨国贸易、国家信用，甚至影响战争与和平。货币的背后首先是信任。我们愿意接受一张钞票，不是因为那张纸本身有多大价值，而是因为相信别人也会接受它，相信发行者能够维护它的稳定，相信这套制度不会在下一刻失去作用。也正因为如此，货币从来不只是经济工具，它还是一种社会关系，一种制度关系，甚至是一种政治关系。信任存在，货币的支付、计价和储值功能才能成立。信任一旦瓦解，这3个功能也会同时受到冲击。更值得警惕的是，现代货币大部分并不是凭空躺在某个保险库里，而是在信贷和债务关系中被创造出来的。当银行向个人或企业发放贷款，新的货币就进入经济体系，而相应的债务也同时产生。换句话说，货币的扩张往往伴随着债务的扩张，只要人们相信债务能够偿还，资产能够支撑信用，体系就能继续运转。可一旦大家开始怀疑债务是否还能被兑现，所谓的价值储存就会变成一个巨大的问号。这也解释了美元为什么能够长期占据国际货币体系的核心位置。美元的地位并非只来自美国的经济规模，更来自历史、制度、市场深度、金融基础设施以及长期累积形成的网络效应。第2次世界大战之后建立的布雷顿森林体系，把美元放在全球金融秩序的中心。1971年，美元与黄金脱钩之后，美国又通过石油贸易、金融市场和全球结算体系为美元寻找了新的支撑。此后，越来越多国家用美元储备、借贷、投资和结算，使用者越多，网络越庞大，美元的地位也就越难被替代。但强大并不等于永恒。2008年全球金融危机之后，外界对美国金融市场稳定性的信心受到冲击。与此同时，美国债务持续扩大，货币政策独立性、金融制裁工具化以及国际规则是否真正公平，也都引发了越来越多的质疑。美元体系并没有因此立刻崩溃，但它的软实力和硬实力确实正在承受压力。真正需要关注的不是某一天美元会不会突然消失，而是全球参与者是否正在逐步寻找更多选择。因此， 所谓去美元化，并不一定意味着美元被另一种货币简单取代，更可能出现的局面是国际货币体系走向多支柱和碎片化，越来越多国家尝试使用本国货币结算。区域支付机制不断发展，中国也通过货币互换、离岸人民币、跨境支付系统和“一带一路”相关贸易网络，逐步扩大人民币的国际使用范围。这些安排的现实意义，不只是为了提高人民币的影响力，也是在金融风险、制裁风险和流动性冲击面前，为参与者增加一层安全垫。不过，人民币国际化仍然是一项长期工程，中国拥有巨大的贸易规模和制造能力。但人民币要成为真正意义上的全球储备货币，还面临自由兑换程度、金融市场开放度、制度透明度、国际信任和避险属性等问题。人民币可以在与中国关系密切的贸易网络中发挥更大作用，却距离被全球市场普遍当作最终避险资产还有相当长的距离。中国的目标也未必是复制美元的单一霸权，更可能是建立一套能够降低外部依赖、增强自身韧性的平行支柱。这其中还存在一个重要矛盾，中国希望人民币走向国际化，但又不能完全放弃对资本流动和汇率的管理。开放越多，外部冲击传入国内的渠道可能越多，控制越强，国际市场又越难完全信任和使用人民币。这种两难决定了人民币国际化不会一蹴而就，而会呈现渐进、分区域、分层次推进的特征。至于欧元，它拥有巨大的经济基础和相对成熟的制度影响力，却仍然没有充分释放自己的国际潜力。一个关键原因在于，欧洲企业在海外贸易中并不总是积极使用欧元计价和开票。货币的国际地位不只取决于经济总量，也取决于企业是否愿意用它做生意。金融机构是否愿意围绕它提供服务，政治共同体是否能够在关键时刻形成一致行动。欧元如果想成为更具吸引力的替代选项，就必须同时面对市场机制、政治协调和战略自主这几重挑战。所以今天的世界并不是一场美元对人民币再加上欧元的简单竞赛，真正发生的是贸易、金融、科技、法律和安全体系彼此交织之后的一次深层冲突。货币竞争的背后是规则之争、发展模式之争，也是不同国家对于安全、主权和繁荣的不同理解。对于许多发展中国家来说，他们既不希望永远依赖美元，也未必愿意完全转向另一套体系。他们真正需要的可能是更多选择，而不是从一种依赖转向另一种依赖。更进一步说，我们还必须追问，货币体系最终应该为谁服务？如果货币不断通过债务扩张和资源开采来创造价值，却把收益集中到少数人手中，把风险转嫁给普通民众和生态环境，那么即使某一种货币赢得了国际竞争，也未必代表人类社会真正赢得了未来。地球只有一个，资源和生态边界也不可能无限扩张。无论是用美元、人民币还是欧元，如果经济逻辑始终建立在无止境攫取之上，最后争夺的可能只是越来越有限的财富。这正是本期内容最值得我们带走的启示：货币体系的变化不能只看汇率，储备比例和支付数据还要看它背后的信任如何形成，权力如何分配，风险由谁承担，以及普通人的生活是否因此变得更加稳定。未来的国际货币秩序也许不会出现一个新的绝对霸主，而会在竞争、合作与区域化之间不断调整。真正有韧性的体系不应该只追求控制别人，更应该让不同国家拥有谈判和选择的空间，让经济增长最终回到改善民生、维护和平和保护环境的目标上。那么你怎么看？美元的主导地位会继续维持，还是会逐步让位于多种货币并存的格局？人民币国际化最大的障碍是金融开放、制度信任还是外部地缘政治环境？而欧元又能不能在未来承担更加独立的国际角色？欢迎把你的观点写在评论区，也欢迎点赞订阅，继续收看更多精彩视频。